Titans is a show that I have loved for quite a long time, but the reasons for which and parts that I adore the most are constantly changing. When you're a kid, it's easy to get drawn into the fantastically flashy fights that this franchise provides, which causes quite an affinity for the episodes where they pretty much just fight for 22 minutes. Eventually though, especially given the fact that I've seen each episode several times, I began to become more interested in the way that the show handled the interpersonal relationships of the Titans throughout the 65 episodes, a period of time in which I happened to launch this YouTube channel and subsequently made over 3 hours of content breaking down the show. And when you look at the show through that lens, as you can hear me talk about into my phone's mic, you tend to prefer the parts of the show like Raven's Season 4 arc, which I used to call my favorite of the show, and which is almost entirely about the character navigating how her relationship with her father changes who she is. And while I do still adore how the show chooses to navigate these relationships, I did just make a 44-minute video on one. In the last several months, as I've predictably gotten back into the show, I've found myself fascinated by how this series handles characterization in a way that you pretty much never see in a show like this. Something exemplified nowhere better than the character whose arc I can't stop thinking about, Terra. Before getting to that though, I do want to quickly establish something to both keep this video under an hour and to keep people from commenting the same points over and over and over again. When approaching this video, I'm going to treat these 6 episodes as if they were the only pieces of Terra media in existence. Obviously, I'm well aware of the fact that, just like most things in the show, that this arc is an adaptation of a part of the 1980s Teen Titans, and namely the Judas Contract, but just given how drastically the show changes Terra's character, it's really not fair to assume that aspects of the story, including that one detail about Slade and Terra that everybody loves to comment about, are canon in this version of the show. This stance also extends to the comics made about the series, but those aren't really relevant until the end of this one, so I'll double back to those when we get there. And with all of that out of the way, it's finally time to dive into some of my favorite episodes of animation, and discuss what makes Terra and everything that revolves around her so damn interesting.
I'm Robin. We're the
Teen Titans. Rock on, it's cool to meet you guys. I'm Terra.
Just in the cold open of this first episode, we get examples of 2 things you'll hear me mention several times throughout this video. The first of which being the fact that from the very first frame that we see the character, Terra is already running away. Given this video's title, you can probably take a good guess at how often I'll bring up this trend within Terra's story. And starting with her visibly fleeing from one of her problems, even if that problem isn't exactly the monster that's chasing her, is still pretty on the nose for the rest of her journey. We'll get back to why she's out in the middle of nowhere in a second, but before we cut to the intro or get her first line of dialogue, we also get a look at arguably the biggest facet of Terra's character, as both the Titans as well as Slade look down upon her as if they're expecting her to make a choice. Furthermore, Terra's hair first falls in such a way to split her face into 2 halves, a motif that we'll see quite a few times before the end of this video, and almost always in moments where the character is pulled between good and evil. Besides just introducing the visuals of the character, as well as her immense power, this cold open succinctly foreshadows 2 of the 3 biggest parts of this character that I'll spend the rest of this video bringing up, ultimately retroactively becoming one of the show's finest opening minutes. Moving on to the other side of the intro, while the conversation between Terra and the Titans might not be super enlightening, with it mostly just establishing hints of Beast Boy's arc while giving us some goofy Cyborg and Starfire moments, it does end with the first example of the dangers of Terra's terraforming, as the cliff beneath a suspicious Raven and Robin begins to crumble. This skeptical pair, and especially Raven, will eventually start to matter in a more significant way, but for this episode, all 5 Titans remain pretty up on Terra, allowing their new nomad friend into their home without much question, and immediately discussing making that arrangement permanent. Something that's made pretty clear as soon as Terra begins to speak is that she wants to be a hero, already knowing everything about the one she just met, and even referring to herself as one. Something that makes her reaction to them discussing adding her to the team pretty jarring, as she nearly runs away, eventually settling on the shore. And besides just having some really great music, this scene with Terra and Beast Boy skipping rocks together gives us both the first confirmation of the romantic angle between the pair, as well as a look into why Terra is always running away and is subsequently without a home. Her inability, especially in moments of stress, to control her powers. Ashley Johnson gives a ridiculously great performance throughout the entire season as Terra, but the way she conveys the immense panic in her voice when this is revealed is absolutely gut-wrenching, portraying such a level of perceived loss because of this shortcoming. Of course, though, even as Terra nearly breaks down upon revealing this information, Beast Boy seems pretty unfazed, as out of the 3.5 Titans with powers, every single one of them is seen struggling to control them at one point or another. Something that only serves to further show that Terra's secrecy and fear of rejection regarding this inability is costing her more than a lack of total control ever really could. Terra will never quite figure this out though, going into training the next day still trying to hide the truth, and ultimately somehow managing to pull it off, at least as far as she's aware. There's such an air of joy within Terra's character after this moment, letting her guard down as if this can finally be the time where nothing goes wrong and she's able to somewhat fit in. Enter Slade. Besides the fact that it's underground, this specific Slade attack doesn't seem to have much of a purpose outside of giving him a chance to talk to Terra, but there is a really interesting fight to talk about before getting to that conversation. One of my favorite things that this show does, that I'll bring up a handful of times in this video, is to bring out the feelings of its combatants through its fight choreography, and you can really see that here. While Terra is present in this fight, she's mostly just doing her own stuff in the background, not interacting with any of the Titans, right up until she accidentally crushes Beast Boy. In the first of several on-screen examples, Terra responds to this moment of adversity not by trying to fix things, but by running away. Something that puts her in the vulnerable state that Slade has been waiting on as he makes his move. Throughout the following scene, as the two of them have something resembling a fight, we get to see Slade once again try to break down a hero, although this time with a much easier target. In this process, you can pinpoint the couple of ideas that he's trying to inject into Terra's mind. Namely that she's out of control and that the Titans will eventually turn on her like everybody else. Something that will never change unless she gets a grip on her abilities, something that Slade claims only he can provide. More so than anything else, what Slade gives Terra in this scene is a way out. Something to seemingly stop the cycle that she's found herself in and get a different outcome. In the end, Terra's only rebuttal to all of this is that through her new friends, and especially Beast Boy, that she's no longer in that cycle, as her secret will just stay safe until it's no longer true. Exactly what Slade wants to hear. This is one of the shortest interactions between these two characters throughout this arc, but it still does such a terrific job in establishing the dynamic between the pair, as Slade positions himself as a gateway to what Terra wants, and she's just barely able to resist, at least for now. In the subsequent Terra freakout, Beast Boy again ends up as her tether back to reality, as her reliance on both him and his ability to keep her lack of control a secret continues to grow, all while her previous conversation continues to roll around in her mind, and her face is once again split by her hair. And while I'm not a huge fan of how the show chose to break this trust through a misunderstanding that nobody seems eager to correct, correct, I do really appreciate how they establish the damning effects that this would have, as Terra gets the closest that she's ever gotten to getting out of this cycle, only for it to be ripped away, leaving her desperate for any kind of change, something that Slade's final words indicate is all he ever needed. While Terra's namesake episode does falter a little bit after the killer cold open, it really does such a great job in establishing the three aspects of her character that the rest of the arc focuses on, as she runs away in the beginning, middle, and end of the episode, is constantly pulled between good and evil, and has several conversations about her lack of control over her powers, all three of which continuing into her sophomore outing. Titan Rising actually comes relatively late in the season in comparison to the usual second episode of an arc, and I think this actually works pretty well for two different reasons. First, while there isn't exactly a timeline in the show, it does help give off the idea that Terra has been gone for some time given the longer than usual gap. However, what this gap actually does for this arc actually comes from the episodes in between, as we get half hours where Raven, Starfire, and to an extent Cyborg are not in full control of their powers. Something that bolsters the ideas that not only did Terra overreact about her inability, but also that in universe it's really hard to perfectly control one's powers, causing immediate suspicion when Terra shows up having done exactly that. Getting into the actual episode, after a well-animated and charming volleyball match between the Titans against a suspiciously orange and black colored background, we're reintroduced to this video's title character, now donning a significantly less charming outfit and accompanied by similarly less optimistic music. The rest of this scene atop Titan's tower actually has some really interesting moments if you watch once knowing Terra's true purpose and where her psyche is by this point. Throughout the next episode and a half, Terra's entire goal is to infiltrate the Teen Titans through deception, ultimately leaving them vulnerable to an attack that, as clearly as this Cartoon Network show can describe, was meant to kill each and every one of them. Yet, in this moment, it's pretty clear that's not what she's thinking about. All of this interaction, and really most of Terra's interactions with characters not named Raven in this one, is mostly surface level stuff, as she reinserts herself back into their lives and shows off her new and sudden ability to control her powers. But I do want to highlight this specific moment right at the start. For reasons that this episode seems unwilling to really explain, despite the lack of any real information, the Titans are initially and suddenly hesitant to allow Terra to join the team, something that prompts her to tear up. And while this could seem like the character trying to gain sympathy, and that may certainly play a part in it, the show intentionally has her turn around for this moment, meaning that, with nobody watching, there was no reason for her to pretend to be visibly upset. Despite everything that she's done, and everything that she's planning to do, some part of Terra genuinely believes that she still has a chance to be a true Teen Titan. And perhaps most tragically of all, she probably does. As I mentioned before, the rest of this episode largely focuses on the relationship between Raven and Terra, something that sets up one of my favorite fight scenes ever by the end of this arc, but unfortunately leaves this half hour as the least interesting that we'll talk about today. Despite this though, in between some awkwardly written interactions where Raven attempts to justify her jealousy of Terra's charm and sudden ability to control her powers, the rest of the episode does provide some neat little moments that are worth spending some time on, starting with some more fight choreography. I slightly touched on it before, but this fight is where Terra's lack of training with the team is best seen, as while the other Titans silently and smoothly transition in and out of working together, everything that Terra does with anybody must be verbally telegraphed beforehand. In general, this episode doesn't exactly have terrific action, but this first fight does serve as a nice comparison comparison point for something that I'll double back to later. Another thing worth mentioning before getting to the ending is just how Terra-specific this whole Slade scheme is. I think that there may be an interesting discussion over whether or not Slade would have conveniently turned off the machine and let Terra save the day if she did manage to destroy the computer, but either way, this is an evil plan that can only really be stopped by Terra. Something that she promptly does, and something that she's promptly rewarded for. Given a room in the tower that she just saved, and a spot on the team that she's meant to destroy. The end of this episode features yet another terrific voice performance, as Terra balances the joy of acceptance with the pain of what's to come, with her hair falling in such a way to both represent the struggle and resemble the man responsible. In general, while Titan Rising is certainly not a bad episode, it's probably best described as the bridge to some really fantastic episodes. As I talked about before, besides the facts that Terra is once again a Teen Titan and is clearly hiding something, the important development from this episode is the newfound trust between her and Raven. Something that manifests itself here in some pretty bland drama, but ultimately becomes more than worth it. Speaking of which, a good chunk of the stuff I want to talk about from this episode really applies more in the 4 episodes left to come. So let's go ahead and skip past the couple of frames of Terra that we get at the end of Winner Take All, and get to the quite aptly named Betrayal.
Oh, wanna do something tomorrow night?
Tomorrow. I'm sorry, Beast Boy, I can't.
Throughout the fight scenes of the last 2 episodes, Terra obviously hadn't spent the time with the Titans required for any kind of chemistry. Something that's immediately different by the time we get to Betrayal's cold open. Likely so the network had more freedom to shift airing order, or just more standalone adventures to rerun, there's not an episode in this entire season where Terra actually has an adventure with the rest of the team, meaning that the gap in time since Titan Rising needed to be shown in this episode. Something that Betrayal does by removing any of the awkwardness, both in the dialogue and in the choreography, that comes with the team adding a new member, as it genuinely feels like Terra's been here the whole time, something that makes the episode's titular event sting that much more. Speaking of which, while I've never been an enormous fan of the title of this episode and its unsubtlety, the end of this cold open does announce to the audience the connection between Slade and Terra, as if it was something that you should already know, and I actually think that's worth talking about for a second. I'm skipping ahead a bunch, but something that will eventually become a bigger thematic element of this arc is the idea of choice, and whether or not Terra could have avoided the situation. Obviously, for anybody who has ever watched Teen Titans, it's pretty clear what the show's view on this topic is, something made intimately clear through Raven's arc a couple of seasons later. But I think you can make a solid argument, as this cold open's bluntness seems to imply, that this was the only outcome that was ever possible. Of course, Terra, after being rejected by her only friends, would run to the man who promised to help her. What else would she have possibly done? After one last team bonding moment with Terra, and one that she undercuts by making the claim that she's just, quote, doing her job like everybody else, the episode splits off into Beast Boy and Terra having cute moments, and the latter's actions nearly causing the deaths of 80% of the show's title characters. Seriously though, to start with the pair, while BB being interested in Terra is something that's a constant throughout this entire arc, it's this episode that finally fully focuses on it, starting with him giving her the wonderfully thematic gift of a heart-shaped mirror, literally and metaphorically forcing Terra to look at herself within the context of the relationships she's built with the Titans, and mostly Beast Boy. And of course, as you've hopefully picked up by now, anytime that Terra is forced to reckon with the things that she's done, or any kind of hard decision, she runs away, taking Beast Boy on a tour of her past while all of his friends are being annihilated. Something I really appreciate about this portion of the episode is how the show mirrors the feelings that Terra is going through throughout these interactions in how the story is being presented to the audience. While the pair have various cute moments at various cute locations that are important for the end of the video by the way, Terra is constantly having her mood ruined by remembering the horrible sin that she's committed, just as the audience's view of these events is constantly cut by watching the defense at Titan's Tower. Despite the fact that Terra is already pretty clearly being depicted as a tragic character, the show never really lets her off the hook for the terrible things that she's done. Toward the end of their date, at least the part of their date that somewhat resembles a date, Terra starts to somewhat confess what she did, almost trying to trick Beast Boy into accepting her apology by first getting him to agree that no fact about her could change their relationship. Something that obviously doesn't apply to things like, I more or less got all of your friends killed. Unfortunately though, we don't get to see whether or not a love-stricken Beast Boy might disagree with me here, as Slade shows up to take control of the situation, only for it to not really work. Sure, outside of all of the Titans dying, Slade does kind of get what he wants by the end of the episode, but it's not really by any fault of his own. As Terra will point out later in this episode, there's really nothing that actually tethers her to Slade just because he mysteriously trained her. Therefore, throughout this entire interaction, she gives Beast Boy pretty much every chance to save her from herself, even characteristically trying to run away with him in the middle of the fight. But throughout this entire process, Beast Boy doesn't budge, wanting to hear Slade out and taking Terra into the last place she'd ever want to be, a Hall of Mirrors, a place where all she can do is gaze upon herself. And after Beast Boy rightfully has a mental breakdown upon the revelation that his girlfriend is a secret agent and his friends are being quote-unquote annihilated, it's now Terra's turn to go through the same thing, as Ashley Johnson delivers this line.
I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen.
The anguish here is just so palpable, as she desperately begs for yet another chance, only for Beast Boy's response to unfortunately be both pretty fair as well as equally guttural.
Then why did you let it?
Throughout her life, at least the life implied within the show, Terra is constantly feeling guilty for things that her powers accidentally do, only for everybody to tell her that it's not the big deal that she finds it to be. But this is different. Traumatized or not, she's intentionally ruined Beast Boy's life, only to act like he promised he'd forgive her. Yet, despite this, you can't watch this episode and not feel your heart being ripped out. Terra has spent her entire life wanting two things: control over her powers and a place to call home. And now she feels like the price for the former is to destroy any chance of ever obtaining the latter. Betrayal is 22 minutes of unimaginably great television, giving us a well-done peek into Terra's shattered psyche and the damage that years of trauma, as well as a bond with Slade, has caused to her ability to perceive and react to reality. But more so than anything else, Betrayal is a beautifully told tragedy. Throughout this episode, Terra has so many opportunities to do the right thing and get her perfect outcome, but she just can't see it. Even after everything she's done, if Terra had just pushed a bit harder with her apology, perhaps after Beast Boy learned that the attack wasn't successful, she probably could have gotten her spot on the team back. But none of that really matters. Terra has finally gotten the rejection from Beast Boy that she was so worried about, and has decided that it's proof that she'll never have a place to call home. And if she can't have one, then she might as well make sure that nobody else can either.
My name is Terra. I have done horrible things, and I have absolutely no regrets.
Unlike my thoughts on the previous episode's title, I absolutely love what the show chose to name their two-part season finale. as Aftershock perfectly captures the figurative earthquake that the Teen Titans felt when their good-natured tendency for trust was ripped from them. Despite this though, after a great little reminder that Terra is working with Slade, something we get through this slightly goofily intense back and forth in front of some magma, we actually open up to a surprisingly chill scene with our Teen Titans. Something that I feel does a good job in highlighting the shared trait among the team of being able to somewhat ignore the traumatic events of their superhero lives. Something necessary for them to be able to do stuff like take on evil magicians while in the middle of a world-threatening plot. Anyway, this lighthearted opening with our cast joking around in Cyborg's car also allows for this scene to serve as a representation of Terra's insertion into their lives, as she takes their joyful attitude and absolutely wrecks it. The opening fight that follows has a ton of really fun shots, including some rare civilian interaction, but the obvious focus is how, despite what she's done, none of the Titans are especially eager to take their opponent out, and this hesitation goes both ways. Each side has multiple opportunities to land significant blows, and yet they always seem to wait until something stops them from doing so. And while the idea that these former friends wouldn't be overly excited to annihilate each other isn't exactly a revelation, what is a revelation is what ends this interaction, being the reveal that Terra's new outfit allows for Slade to take control. The irony of this will become a bit more heavy-handed in like 20 minutes or so, but even as it's initially revealed, the episode almost completely stops to let the audience soak it in. Terra has ruined her entire life in search for the ability to control her powers, and ultimately, in what she thought would finally fix her problem, she just gave up what control she had in the first place. This thematic gut punch is also accompanied with what is by far the most interesting use of Terra's powers, as she forms obedient rock minions. Minions that, just like Terra, are ultimately under Slade's control. This, in conjunction with the clear emotional distress of this encounter being sprung upon them, is ultimately too much for the team, as Robin gives the exceptionally rare command to retreat, with Beast Boy needing one more look to really believe what just happened. Back at the tower, the show delivers some of its most impressive sound design, as the deafening silence is only cut by Cyborg rhythmically removing stones from his suit, one by one. This effect, in conjunction with some unusually stagnant camera angles, ultimately creates this simultaneously tense yet somber atmosphere for the following argument to take place. While each Titan in this moment is going through something slightly different due to their unique relationships to Terra, the overwhelming consensus among the 4 non-Beast Boy members of the team is mostly frustration towards feeling as if they were tricked, and that their trust was closer to foolishness. It's the idea that Terra was born evil, lived evil, and will die evil, and that they should have been able to figure it out before it stung them. On the other hand though, Beast Boy knows the part that he played in creating the Terra that ambushed them. And while nobody would think that it was his fault that things turned out the way that they did, his interaction with her in the amusement park makes it pretty clear that getting to this point wasn't inevitable. Terra even quoted Beast Boy's last words toward her about her not having any friends when asked why she was doing all of this. More so than any other Titan, Beast Boy knows that Terra wasn't simply destined to become this evil force, causing his frustration to instead be focused on his teammates for giving up on her, especially when she isn't exactly the first Titan to work for Slade. Obviously, we know that her situation isn't really comparable to Robin's stint as an apprentice, but it is not entirely unreasonable for Beast Boy to want to believe that it might be, eventually convincing the team to give his friend one more chance, an opportunity that she has no interest in taking. The final chapter of this episode takes place in 3 locations, as the Titans split up to take on the newly freed Plasma, Cinderblock, and Overload. 3 perfectly personality-devoid villains that mostly serve as plot devices to get our characters to some beautiful locations. This isn't to say that these opening fights suck or anything, as there actually is a bit of neat choreography tucked within, but it's pretty clear that these initial scuffles are just set up for the 2 terrific brawls that close this episode. And starting with one of, if not my favorite from the entire show, Raven v Terra. And when I say that this fight is one of Teen Titans' best, it's for 3 main reasons, starting with the aforementioned location. The Electro Arena for the Overload fight is already pretty neat, but watching it become completely coated in mud creates such an intimately messy setting for the intimately messy fight. Also, the dark gray background clashes really well with both Terra's incoming mud as well as Raven's jet black spells. Despite all of this though, the real visual mastery of this scene largely has the unreal choreography to blame, as the show perfectly juxtaposes the emotionally drained Terra with the outrageously angered Raven, as the latter's attacks get more and more vicious as well as more and more visually interesting. The attacks from both fighters, as they largely try to actually drown each other, creates this intoxicating feeling of hatred that the show never really replicates. And despite Beast Boy's plea, there is not an attack on either side here that doesn't feel like it's trying to be fatal, as Raven's demon side quickly takes over. But despite all of this, which would make it into a great fight even without volume, it's the dialogue that soars above all here, as Terra just absolutely breaks Raven. This is where the occasionally frustrating Titan Rising quickly becomes worth it, as we know just how difficult it was for Raven to trust another person, and how difficult the subsequent betrayal must be. And on Terra's side, she clearly demonstrates the non-physical advantages of her time in the tower, as her knowledge of Raven's ultimate weakness proves too much to overcome, weaponizing her fear of losing her friends and causing the rage within Raven to bubble up more and more. And it's the release of this rage that creates such a great moment, as Raven loses control of her powers, and it ultimately, at least seemingly, costs her everything. While most of the fights in this show are these grand 5v1 all-out brawls, it's these intimate little showdowns that allow the series to both highlight its impeccable choreography and how it ties that choreography together with some terrific character writing. Unfortunately though, for both Raven and the audience, this fight does eventually have to end, with Terra's next 3 eliminations coming without much fanfare, quickly taking out Cyborg, Beast Boy, and Starfire, and setting up the final showdown of the episode, and perhaps the best fight of the show to not be the best fight of its own episode, Robin v Terra. Just as the muddy environment made the last duel into pretty much a mirror match, Robin is able to keep his opponent too close for her terraforming to really come into play, as this quickly becomes pretty much just hand-to-hand combat. Subsequently, Robin is actually given many opportunities to do significantly more damage than he actually does, ultimately allowing his promise to Beast Boy to come into play. Just like the previous episode, Terra is once again forced, this time a bit more directly, to gaze upon her own reflection, but this time it doesn't faze her. After killing 4 of her previous friends, Terra no longer feels any guilt for becoming who she currently is. She is a killer on a mission, and there's no amount of Robin's heroic statements about how only she can save herself that's going to be able to break through. Before Robin is able to come to that conclusion though, Terra's able to get enough space to make this into a rock fight, and a fight that she quickly wins, taking her spot next to Slade's throne. Somewhat interestingly though, this episode doesn't actually end on Terra here, as we get to see a side of the Titans that we've never really seen before. Obviously, the Teen Titans were never all going to die in the second season of Teen Titans, so the fact that they did survive isn't really much of a reveal, but the reveal that they're all hiding in the shadows that are usually occupied by their opponents, certainly is. Terra's betrayal has driven our heroes to a place they've never gone before, as they collectively give up any hope of bringing her back to the good side and decide that she must be stopped. Stopped by any means necessary. We'll get to the second half of this finale in a second, but I do want to quickly go back a bit and focus on one piece of Terra's dialogue, as she tells Robin that he's wrong about her needing to be saved, and that she was the one who wanted things to turn out this way. Obviously, as an audience, we know that this is wrong, as she visibly spent the entire back half of the last episode trying to get Beast Boy to somehow forgive her, and has obviously wanted to be a Teen Titan at several points. As I mentioned before, this episode has already revealed the irony of Slade actually taking control from Terra instead of giving it to her. And this line is Terra trying to deceive herself into getting it back. So far, everything that Slade has helped Terra do is something that she wanted to happen. Sure, while he has been controlling her, he hasn't actually forced her to do something against her will. And it's because of this that Terra is able to pretend that her and Slade are actually partners. And it's ultimately the reveal that this isn't true that causes her final breakdown. Before getting to the actual storyline of this part 2, I first have to talk about the music. Hopefully, if copyright allowed, I've been playing music from the show throughout the background of this video, but in this episode, it almost becomes vampiric. I know that's a weird way to describe it, but whatever it is, it creates a soundscape unlike anything else in the show, which matches the visuals of this episode, which are also unlike anything else in this show. We'll get back to how this episode looks in a second, but first, I want to talk about this really interesting cold open. Well, the script for this one once again features Terra talking about her new life of committing atrocities in ways that we've already heard. It's the visuals that have some pretty strange imagery here. There are a bunch of things that you could talk about here, like the interesting cuts of the Titans each falling back to back to back to back to back into an empty chasm, but it's the shattering of Beast Boy's gift as well as this particular frame that I want to focus on. To start with the former, the heart-shaped mirror has always been representative of Terra looking at herself through the lens of her relationship with the Titans, making the inverse true as we watch it break apart, and she further separates herself from that part of her life. But more interesting than that is this shot of her reflection upon it being shattered, as the right side of her face falls out of frame. Throughout this entire episode, the once occasional hair falling over the right side is almost permanent, and it's this frame that indicates that it symbolically is. The once tough decision between good and evil is seemingly made, as Terra declares as we head into the intro that she's done horrible things and yet has no regrets. Coming back into the episode, we get to watch Terra flash back to good times with the friends she's destroyed in the city she's destroyed. And besides just giving us some really impressive sequences, I think these moments do a great job in filling in the gaps. As I mentioned before, this show doesn't really have a timeline, so it's not exactly clear how much time passed between Titan Rising and Betrayal, but it's scenes like this that help it seem pretty lengthy. The visuals here are just so stellar too, as we cut from the colorful past to the bleak present, as Terra has sucked the joy out of an entire city, and as she's about to learn, an entire team too. When depicting the Titans' ambush of Terra, I find it really interesting how the show frames it as if Terra was the protagonist and our heroes the villains. She is the one who's verbalizing her thoughts, and she's the one who we see the entirety of, all while the Titans stay uncharacteristically quiet and in the shadows. It's pretty harrowing to watch too, as Terra begs for any kind of rebuttal or show of kindness from her opponents, who return the favor by everybody, including Beast Boy, thrashing her. She's completely worn out any welcome from the only people who ever accepted her, as they've come to the conclusion that she's a lost cause. With the ambush nature of their encounter from the last episode reversed, Terra pretty quickly realizes that she's not gonna win this one, attempting to retreat, only for any hope of Slade respecting her autonomy to be quickly dashed. Slade choosing to send her into a losing battle battle, if you can even call it a battle, just absolutely demolishes Terra, even more than the physical thrashing that she's currently taking. Terra has destroyed the entirety of her relationship with the outside world for this one man, who's now taken the one thing he promised to give her, leaving her as simply a human weapon. She is eventually able to escape though, at least for the time being, due to the credits-named combination of the brain-dead villainous trio, Terra'ble, who's kind of boring. While the Titans are busy with that, Terra makes her way back to her master, running away yet again, only to receive the same type of treatment. The path that Terra has taken has led to everybody rejecting her, and when she attempts to flee one final time, as she always does, Slade informs her that that's not a possibility. The suit that she willingly put on has fused with her skin, leaving her trapped as nothing but a weapon for Slade's will, seemingly until the day she dies. News that she responds to by doing the only thing that she can, laying down and beginning to weep. Meanwhile, the Titans are fighting a big brain-dead monster. Seriously though, while there are some cool shots in this fight between Terra'ble and the Titans, it just pales so heavily in comparison to the Terra stuff, an opinion that Beast Boy luckily shares, leaving the fight to chase down his former friend, only to find her begging for her own destruction. And while I believe that a lot of shows in this situation would have Beast Boy recognize Terra's predicament and immediately forgive her for what she did, that's not what this episode does. And I absolutely love it. Even though he's obviously still love-stricken, Beast Boy refutes Terra's claim that she has no control, as he delivers one of my favorite lines of the season.
You chose to work for Slade, chose to betray us, and now you've chosen to give him control. Slade isn't doing this, Terra. You are!
This idea that things just happen to Terra without her involvement is something that has permeated throughout her entire arc, and it's such a great moment to see it finally called out. Yes, Terra has obviously been dealt a bad hand, and while pretty much every superpowered being in the show struggles with their powers, she obviously has it worse than most. But that doesn't excuse the horrible things that she's done. Despite hearing this though, as you will likely expect, Terra does not want to accept this, preferring to live in a reality where her misdeeds aren't her fault, and accepting Slade's control, even as he prepares to take out the closest friend that she's ever had. At this point, as we reach the climax of the entire arc, the rest of the Titans join the party, and begin screaming at Terra to not make this unfixable mistake. Words that quickly begin to jumble together to the point of incomprehension. And it's as Terra takes a second to really take in what she's about to do, that Beast Boy finally manages to break through.
It's your life, Terra. Your choice. It's never too late to change.
Despite all of the horrible circumstances surrounding her and all of the horrible decisions that she's made, it's still Terra's life to live, and until it's over, it's hers to change too. And that's exactly what she does, finally truly taking control and doing what she wants to do with her powers, destroying the man who destroyed her life. And while it is pretty cathartic to see Slade finally being taken down after doing such horrible things to our heroes, it's even more meaningful to see Terra finally take control of her life, even if she still has to deal with the consequences of her past. During her thrashing of Slade, in conjunction to the sketchy underground stuff the villain had likely been doing the whole time, Terra causes tectonic activity that's ultimately going to wreck whatever is left of the city, as the Titans begin to flee and invite her to join them. Only for Terra, for the first time this season, to make the decision to deal with her problems instead of just running away, knowing that she's the only one who can prevent mass destruction. After a lifetime of running away, as Terra explains to Beast Boy, she realizes that it's not too late to reverse what she's done, making the decision to fix her mistake, even knowing the price she'll pay. And even though I've seen this episode upward of a dozen times, and multiple times in the process of making this video, watching Terra choose to turn her legacy around still hits just as hard. After an entire life of feeling like she has no control and constantly running away from her problems, Terra decides in her last moments to finally stay, ultimately saving the city that she once brought to its knees. Aftershock ends with a eulogy from Beast Boy in the style of Terra's opening monologue, describing how, in her final moments, she became the hero she always wanted to be. The statue that she becomes provides the perfect place for the heartbreaking final words of the episode, as Beast Boy declares to never forget his friend who, despite a plunge to the darkest place imaginable, still made the greatest sacrifice of all. And while this ending would have been a tragic yet perfect ending to Terra's tale, there is still one final chapter of her story left. So while I still have a couple of things to say about this season, let's skip ahead a bit to the final Terra episode and the final episode of the show, Things Change. Recently, I've become more aware of the idea that there is some percentage of the people who watch these videos who don't participate in the discourse of the shows I talk about, instead only taking in their own opinion and eventually mine as well. And while I really wish that you could continue to live in what sounds like a perfect world, I feel like I owe it to you to let you know that Things Change, the final episode of this beloved show, is nothing short of hated. And while in the last couple of years things have cooled down a bit, with some different perspectives finally being shared, the overwhelming opinion is still that this is a weird cliffhanger episode that betrays everything great about the show. And now that you know the popular consensus on this half hour, let me share my take. This is my favorite episode. Not of this arc, or even of this show, but out of every episode of every show that I have ever consumed, this is my absolute favorite. And while I'm not going to dive into every reason why this is the case, as a good chunk of it isn't really relative to this video, I do think that it's important to kind of set the stage for this one non-Terra-wise. Things Change comes after the world-traveling arc of the show's 5th season, and besides the eventual movie, serves as the series finale. And besides a slightly cheaper animation style that indicates that this one was added on a bit later than everything else, there are a few other things that seem to imply that, contrary to popular belief, this was indeed intended as the series finale, the biggest of which being the theme of change. Whenever this episode isn't about Terra, it's about the Titans fighting a monster that's pretty clearly the physical representation of change, both in its abilities as well as the way they talk about it, as it's a monster that can't be detected, can't be predicted, can't be stopped, and is eventually going to destroy everything. It's one of the only times in the show that the villain isn't defeated by the end of the episode, as the Titans seemingly remain locked in an unwinnable fight. Well, 4 of the Titans, as Beast Boy's a bit busy with a different unwinnable battle. And that brings us to Terra, who's maybe in this episode. Given the way that this story is presented to the audience, it's pretty clearly meant to be somewhat ambiguous whether or not all of the events on screen are actually happening. So while there are a bunch of great clues, both physical, like the fact that pizza is only handed to Beast Boy instead of in the middle of the table, and symbolically, like this shot indicating that Beast Boy is just seeing the reflection of the girl he used to know, for the sake of this video, I'm just gonna treat everything as literal as possible. As while a thematic analysis or an analysis of Beast Boy's psyche are both interesting ways to look at this episode, neither of them really fit within a Terra analysis. This is also the reality that the ambiguously canon comics that I promised I wouldn't mention reflect, and I'd personally be shocked if these events aren't part of the likely inevitable Terra'ble Titans continuation. Anyway, enough preamble. Let's finally get into the Terra of this episode, who's eventually found at school and who claims to have no idea who Beast Boy is, at least at first. This actually brings up an interesting question that I think sometimes gets lost in the discussion of whether or not this episode actually happened, which is just how much does Terra actually remember. By the end of this episode, she pretty clearly at least has an inherent understanding that Beast Boy is telling the truth, but whether or not she developed that throughout the episode, had it the entire time, or never lost her memory at all, is kind of up for debate. My guess would be the middle option, and that she didn't have perfect recollection, but enough to remember Beast Boy, at least conceptually, but I kinda think it's up to each viewer what they take from it. Anyway, their first interaction at the school doesn't really have terribly much to analyze, as she eventually just agrees to entertain Beast Boy's request, but the same cannot be said about their subsequent pizza date. After exchanging pleasantries, things quickly turn to Terra's complicated past, which eventually causes her to ask this question.
Why would you want to be friends with someone who is so much trouble?
If you are part of the camp that believes that Terra remembers everything, then this is a pretty depressing revelation, and one that seems to indicate that her new life is built out of shame for what she did. But I don't really think that's the case. As their date continues back to the tower, there's an interesting development in how Terra begins to talk to Beast Boy, as she subtly switches from telling him that she's not Terra to telling him that she's not the girl that he remembers. A lot of this episode is written in a way to add to its dreamlike feel, and thus is a little bit harder to truly parse, but it's not difficult to see the pain that Terra is in as she sees pieces of the life that she threw away, all while knowing that she still can't go back. After some more shenanigans, including a callback to the stone skipping of Terra's first episode, as well as a trip to the iconic locations of Betrayal, where Slade spends his final appearance sending a robot to tell Beast Boy that Terra has chosen to forget about him, we finally approach my favorite television conversation ever, as Beast Boy forces Terra to confront her past, and she doesn't run away.
I'm not running from anything.
And it's as the heartbreaking piano softly sings, and the show presents some genuinely stunning angles, that we get to hear the final words of the show, with Terra being as honest as she possibly can. In desperation, Beast Boy begins his final plea by trying to convince Terra that she was happy back then, something that I hope you can tell just wasn't true. She points this out to him as well, telling him that while he saw a lot of happy Terra moments, her biggest moments of misery occurred when he wasn't around. She largely lived a life of deception and pain, and the idea of returning to it just isn't palatable. As Terra mentioned before, she's not running away from her past life, she's just cutting ties with the world that brought her so much misery. Throughout this entire interaction, Terra becomes more and more cognizant that pretending to have zero knowledge of the past isn't going to get Beast Boy to leave her alone, finally taking a different approach with this line, one of my all-time favorites and a quote that encapsulates the entirety of Terra's story.
Things changed, Beast Boy. The girl you want me to be is just a memory.
The Terra that skipped stones and went on adventures and cried with Beast Boy is gone, and she's never coming back. In her newly awoken state, Terra has chosen to create a new life for herself. After all, it's never too late to change. All that chasing her dreams of being a hero did was bring her pain. So, finally, she decided to take a different course. I know that I couldn't get into every aspect of this episode that I love so dearly while keeping things within the scope of this video, but I hope I've done a good job in communicating why I feel it's such a perfectly somber ending to a perfectly somber character. One of the biggest ideas central to the Aftershock two-parter is that, while Terra can still change from her path of evil, that doesn't mean that she's free from the consequences of her actions, and it's this episode that expands upon those consequences. Even if Terra is no longer a statue, she can't just return to her old life as if nothing happened, as what's likely best for her is to find a new place with new friends and new aspirations. As a finale to an action show, I understand the perspective that it's unsatisfying and frankly a bit bit weird. But as the finale to a tragic character, it's heartbreakingly perfect. As of the time I'm recording this, it's been over a month since I started working on this video, and during that entire time, I've been thinking about how I wanted to conclude things. Terra is a character that has had a good amount of time devoted to her psyche throughout the show, and I knew that after what's probably been like 45 minutes of discussion, it would be hard to squeeze that much more out of the character. So during these last few minutes, instead of just continuing to talk about how tragic her story is, I instead want to talk about her tale as it relates to the series in which it takes place. As is common for the genre, pretty much every hero in the show has some kind of a tragic past, even if it's hardly ever mentioned. Therefore, and this is something that's explored pretty heavily towards the end of the show, there's a constant theme of having to overcome your shitty circumstances in order to do some good in the world anyway. As I mentioned before, there is a way to look at some of Terra's actions here as inevitable, as obviously she was going to run to Slade when he promised to help her, and obviously she would continue down that path when Beast Boy rejected her. But even if that is the case, the ending of her story makes it clear that she always had a choice. Sure, there are some things that were simply out of her control, but it was only once she was able to overcome her learned helplessness that she began to take control of the things that she could, including what she spent her perceived final moments doing. Besides a few little examples like Thunder and Lightning and eventually Jinx, Teen Titans is a show with good guys who start and end good, and bad guys who start and end bad. It's just something that's somewhat necessary for the usually episodic nature of the show, and I don't really believe that it largely hinders their ability to tell interesting stories, but either way, it's in this regard that Terra feels unique within this quite unique show. Just as how being a good person didn't stop Terra from doing evil things, what her future actions looked like wasn't reliant on what she had done in the past. Even after everything that happened to her, and everything she did because of it, it was never too late for Terra to do the next right thing. And really, that's what Teen Titans is all about. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to everybody who not only waited ridiculously long for this video, but also who made it nearly an hour into it. This is a video that I've always wanted to make, but I never really thought that people would be nearly interested enough in it to make the investment worth it. Something that the comments on my last Titans video proved I was clearly wrong about. As you might be able to figure out, there is one more story in this show that I think I can make a video about in this style, so if you do want to hear me talk about Raven's struggle to overcome her destiny, please let me know in the comments, as it truly means a lot to know that people want the stuff that I spend dozens of hours making. Also, one final thing, and then I promise I'll quit because my voice is almost gone. If you scroll down to the pinned comment, assuming I don't forget to put it there, I'd really appreciate if you could take that survey. I'm beginning to plan out content for the rest of the year, so if you'd like a say on what I cover next, please take a minute or two to fill it out. Either way, this has been Ample Samuel, and I'll see you guys in a couple of weeks with thankfully a shorter video. Thanks for watching.